This is really startling smoking gun evidence in the census case that really undercuts why the Trump administration added this question. So the Trump administration added the citizenship question, and they claimed it was needed to better enforce the Voting Rights Act. Well, these new documents from Tom Hofeller show that it was not needed to enforce the Voting Rights Act. And in fact, the people that would be most harmed by the addition of the citizenship question, Latinos and other racial minorities, are the very groups the Voting Rights Act was designed to protect. And it clearly shows that this question was added to benefit the Republican Party, particularly white Republicans. Because Tom Hofeller says in this unpublished study that is now key evidence in this case, this would be clearly a disadvantage to Democrats and an advantage to Republicans. So there you have it. I mean, this is really black and white. You can't get any more explicit than this. We now know for certain this is why the question was added to the census.
And talk about how we know this. Talk about Hofeller's estranged daughter.
Well, it's a pretty wild story. So there's a separate case in North Carolina challenging the gerrymandering of state legislative districts. Tom Hofeller has been the go-to expert in the Republican Party for decades on redistricting. And he's drawn some of the most extreme gerrymandered maps in places like North Carolina. And so there's a case challenging this map in North Carolina, and after Hofeller passed away, his daughter found hard drives with all of his work, and she gave it over to the plaintiffs challenging these gerrymandering.
Gave it to Common Cause,
Gave it to
right?
Common Cause and other plaintiffs challenging the gerrymandering in North Carolina. Now some of this evidence has now become public. There is more here too, by the way, Amy. We're going to learn more about the role that Tom Hofeller has played in gerrymandering efforts in other cases, but this pertains directly to the census case.
So the New York Times calls him the Michelangelo of gerrymandering. Talk about his whole history and also how this could have legal bearing and even going to the issue of the Supreme Court making a decision about Wilbur Ross adding the citizenship question in the census.
So Tom Hofeller is not a household name, but he's been an extremely influential person in the Republican Party for decades. He's basically been the Republican Party's go-to guy when it comes to redistricting. So he's traveled since the 1980s, state after state after state, drawn maps to boost Republican representation. And a lot of these maps, particularly after the 2010 election, have been struck down in court. So really gerrymandered maps he drew in places like North Carolina and Ohio have been invalidated by the courts. In fact, the North Carolina congressional map that Hofeller drew was invalidated by the Supreme Court in an opinion written by Clarence Thomas, who found that it was an unconstitutional racial gerrymandering. So even Clarence Thomas thought that the maps that Hofeller was drawing were too extreme. And the fact that you had the architect of GOP gerrymandering drawing up the census citizenship question is so startling, Amy, because the census forms the basis for redistricting. So we have to have unfair, inaccurate census data to be able to draw fair districts. If we have skewed census data, that's going to lead to skewed districts. So even before they start the gerrymandering itself, they're essentially gerrymandering the census to give themselves an advantage.